All right, I'm going to start with and talk a little bit about managing soil fertility and grazing systems. And at the start of when Matt was kind of doing the introduction, one of the things he talked about was regenerative grazing. And Mary asked the question of, what's the first thing you should do, if you're interested in kind of restoring that system? And Matt's answer was really we need to think about soil fertility. And I think that's important. Most of you have probably seen the regenerative grazing group on Facebook. If you're on, who's on Facebook? Everybody on Facebook, maybe? Everybody seen the regenerative grazing group? Kind of a neat group, right? It's a lot of information getting shared that's producer to producer. Sometimes it's really good information. Sometimes it's, I see Matt commenting on it, and I comment when I can't stand it anymore on some of the posts. But it's one of those peer-to-peer things, and it's good to encourage each other to do a better job with grazing management. But one of the biggest mistakes I see with regenerative grazing is that people get on this Facebook groups and they go, well, man, this is great. I'm going to be a regenerative grazer, and they buy a farm that's been in tobacco for 50 years and or been mismanaged under a hay cutting by the neighbor for 30 years and half grown up in briars, and they said, well, I'm going to be a regenerative grazer now, and they put some cows out there, and next thing you know, they're losing weight and there's nothing for them to eat, and the soil fertility is so low that you can't get any persistent desirable forages in the grazing system. So that having that base level of soil fertility is really important as people start their grazing journey. And this presentation is not comprehensive by any means in terms of soil fertility, but it gives you about 8 or 9 principles to think about when you're starting to think about soil fertility and grazing systems. So why is it important? And this is why it's important. This is commodity fertilizer prices. And even though we're better than we were, in 2022, when we really had a spike in commodity fertilizer prices, we're still higher than long-term averages for the cost of things like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. The beauty of a grazing system is that once we build these up, there's not a lot of nutrients removed in a well-managed grazing system. And we're going to talk in more detail about that. But last week when I put this together, urea or nitrogen was, so nitrogen as urea was about 71 cents per pound of nitrogen. After adjusted for nitrogen and diammonium phosphate, which is our primary phosphorus source, it was about 65 cents a pound for P2O5. And if we look at muriate of potash or OO60, it was about 40 cents a pound for a pound of K2O. So fertility can be an expensive part of the system, at least initially when we're building levels up. So thinking about it from kind of a comprehensive approach on how do we manage nutrient flows and nutrient cycles within grazing systems is really, really important as we move forward. So I'm going to go through, I call them tips, but I'm going to go through 9 tips. And the first one is I just want to remind everyone, everybody is looking for that easy button, right? That silver bullet that's going to solve all their problems, and there is none of those for soil fertility. We'd like there to be. And there's a lot of products out there on the market that promise you a lot of different things, but there is no silver bullet. And if just like your mother told you when you were little, if it sounds too good to be true, probably isn't true, right? There's a lot of biological products coming on the market that promise things like activate soil microbes. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but we can activate soil microbes through good grazing management, but there's not a lot of products that will do that. There are some biologicals that are showing some promise of bringing nitrogen into the system in row crop production, but we're not quite there yet. What's probably our most important biological product in terms of forage production? Anybody know? Inoculum for clover roots, right? We know that works. Most of the clover seed that we purchase now comes pre-inoculated. That means we're matching up the right strain of bacteria with that legume plant so that we get efficient nitrogen production. And we'll talk more about that as we move on. Always ask for replicated data. If it sounds too good to be true, ask for replicated data, and that from university trials. And these guys that are selling these products that don't work hate that, because there's usually not a lot of good replicated data to show that they work. A lot of times they'll cherry pick maybe one study that had a positive result. This is one of the products that has been a thorn in my side for a considerable amount of time, and they're very active on Facebook. And it's liquid calcium fertilizer, and they make all kinds of claims like neutralize the soil acidity, aerates the soil, makes nutrients more plant available, and the list goes on and on and on. And the best thing you can do with this product is just don't use it, because it really doesn't work. We did a study with this product several years ago to evaluate the efficacy of liquid calcium as a liming agent, because one of the things that they promise in their ads is cheaper than lime and works faster. And so we did a study on this particular product. It was from Agritech. ProCal was the name of it. Lots of great testimonials on their website. Nope, no replicated data, of course. We did a project at 16 locations. We worked with extension agents and did the same study at 16 different locations within the state of Kentucky. And we compared liquid calcium to agricultural limestone and pelleted limestone, which is just agricultural limestone that's been aggregated into a pellet. And again, at 16 locations across the state. And I'm going to cut right to the chase, and this is what we found. This was the initial soil pH of all of our treatments. So as you can see, they were all statistically similar at the beginning of the study. 12 months later, we measured pH at 6 months also, but I'm not showing that data for time today. But 12 months later, the control and the liquid calcium were exactly the same. Liquid calcium does not adjust soil pH. Even as many times as they tell you it does on Facebook, it does not. Ag limestone and pelleted limestone, we had a significant increase in soil pH. The bottom line of this work is that just use ag limestone. It's our best, if you need to adjust pH, use ag limestone. It's our best opportunity for adjusting soil pH and most cost effective. Okay, tip 2, and this kind of gets back to Matt's point about soil fertility, is that we've got to know where we're starting at, and that comes from soil sampling our pastures and hay fields. Soil testing is going to quantify nutrients so that we can start to manage. It's hard to manage something we don't measure. So just quantifying those nutrients, and there'll be different soil sampling depths from state to state and lab to lab. So just follow whatever your lab is recommending, follow that sampling procedure, because that's what their soil testing has been calibrated for. So we quantify soil pH, which is really important, and phosphorus and potassium, which is two of our primary nutrients. Not so much nitrogen, right? Nitrogen is very mobile in the system, and it's difficult to measure. We've been trying to measure it for a long time with different methods, but not with much success. And again, this provides us baseline data to start to manage the fertility in this system off of. And a lot of people throw their arms up when fertilizer prices get high and say, well, I'm not even going to bother soil testing my pastures because the fertilizer price is high. But really, that's the most important time to be measuring and using soil testing, because it allows you to target those applications of what you need. So you're not over applying phosphorus or potassium if you don't need it in that grazing system or lime. A lot of times if you go to the country store and sit down at the knowledge table in the corner of the country store and say, I've got this weed or that weed, they'll say, well, you need lime or you need phosphorus. Just take a soil test and measure that soil, and then you'll know for sure what you need, and you're not guessing about that application. We've got a really nice soil testing publication for Kentucky, and again, it may vary a little bit from state to state, so just use whatever soil testing publication you have from your extension service in your state. Tip 3, if you need lime, apply lime according to soil test. This is really important because soil acidity, especially in the humid eastern United States, is still a major factor limiting forage production in pastures. And it does two things. It reduces the nutrient availability or the plant availability of other nutrients in the soil, and then it reduces nitrogen fixation in legumes. So we're bringing less nitrogen into the system through dinitrogen fixation carried out by things like clover and alfalfa and Lespedezas and so forth in the grazing system. This is the impact that soil pH has on nutrient availability. So each one of these bands, the fatter the band is, the more plant available that nutrient is. So when we start to look here at an acid pH, we see that the nutrient availability of our primary nutrients decreases as our soil becomes more acidic. So just by applying lime and getting ourselves in this ideal range of 6 to 7, which is really where we want to be in most pasture situations, we increase the availability of all of our macronutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen and potassium, sulfur, calcium, magnesium, all increases as we get our pH right in the grazing system. So lime is a really important input. And the reason I'm showing you this graph is that if you're on a limited budget, and most of the producers that we work with are on limited budgets, if you can make one investment in terms of soil fertility, if you need lime according to the soil test, then apply that lime to make all these other nutrients more available in the soil. So liming neutralizes soil acidity, also supplies some calcium and magnesium. These are some general guidelines, but most of our pastures that are grass legume mixtures are going to require a soil pH of somewhere around 6 to 6.4 should be our target range. And if we're adding alfalfa into the grazing system, then we want to boost that up to 6.5 to 6.8. If we just have grasses, then 5.8 to 6 would be fine for those. Okay, tip 4, implement rotational stocking. We've talked already a lot about grazing management, and a lot of you are sitting there thinking, well, you know, it's good for the plant, but why would it matter for soil fertility? And it is good for the plant. This is a summary of the increase in production. These are different replicated studies that was in a SEEP publication that was paid for by the NRCS, which was a summary of rotational or improved grazing management practices. Anyways, at the end of the day, they found about a 30% increase in productivity of pastures where we went from continuous to rotational stocking. The other thing that improves is nutrient cycling within grazing system, and that's why it's important in terms of soil fertility. So when we have a strong nutrient cycle in pastures, we aren't removing a lot of nutrients. We have things coming in terms of fertilizer, nutrients in terms of fertilizer, manure, could add broiler litter, legumes are bringing nitrogen into the system. Anything we feed brings nutrients into that grazing system. So hay, silage, mineral supplements are all bringing nutrients into the system, and they get cycled around within this system. So they are taken up by the plant, the animal eats the plant. The animal is a very important part of the nutrient cycle within a grazing system. And then the animal uses some of those nutrients, right? But 80 to 90% of those nutrients are excreted back onto that pasture. So how we manage grazing is really important for building that strong nutrient cycle and getting an even distribution of those nutrients coming back out of the animal. And then we have exports from the system, right? So our calves and cull cows would be a cow-calf system, and they're exporting nutrients. John Laurie at the University of Missouri a long time ago did some work with nutrient removal from cow-calf pairs. 10 pounds of nitrogen from a cow-calf pair, 7 pounds of P2O5 and a pound of K2O. It's almost nothing, right? I mean, this is one of the most beautiful things of improved grazing systems is that if we're doing a good job with our grazing management, once we build fertility levels within that pasture to a reasonable level, you don't have to have them off the charts, but if we're in that medium plus range in our terms of soil test results, we're removing very few nutrients from that grazing system. We can build very strong nutrient cycles over time with improved grazing management. whatever you want to call it, amp grazing, mat, or mob grazing. It doesn't matter as long as we're getting good distribution of dung and urine within that pasture. So one of the things that can happen in a grazing system is that we get a redistribution of nutrients within the grazing system. So if I have animals out here and they're grazing and they're consuming that forage, and I'm in one big continuously grazed boundary, so one big pasture, and animals are out there and they're consuming nitrogen and phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, anything that's in that plant, and then where do they go? They go here, the shade and water sources, right? Lay down there in the shade, relax a little bit, maybe lounge around in the pond a little bit if they got some tall fescue toxicosis going, and then they get up to go back out again. What happens when they get up? They make a deposit, right? And over time, what happens is that we concentrate nutrients around shade and water sources in grazing systems. So implementing rotational stocking is a really important part about getting even nutrient distribution within the grazing system. Same scenario, except we divide it up and we supply some water in the pastures. And then we put the animals in there and we say, well, you're going to graze here, but guess what? You're going to deposit those nutrients in that smaller area. And when we implement rotational stocking, we get a much more uniform distribution of nutrients within the grazing system. Not perfect by any means, but much more uniform. And we eliminate concentration of nutrients around shade and water sources. Not completely, because animals need shade when they're grazing, and they're still going to concentrate some nutrients around those shade sources, even in those smaller paddock areas. Okay, tip 5, capitalize on nutrients in hay. So every ton of hay, we think of it as a feed source from the animal standpoint, but it also contains nutrients. A ton of hay will contain about 40 pounds of nitrogen, about 15 pounds of P2O5, and about 50 to 60 pounds of K2O. So every ton of hay that we're feeding, bringing nutrients into that grazing system. If we assume the cost of these nutrients, and those were the costs that I got last week from our local co-op in Princeton, of 71 cents for nitrogen, 65 cents for P2O5, and 38 cents for K2O, 1 ton of hay is going to have about $59 worth of nutrients in it. So just think about that for a second. So I'm bringing that hay into the system. I'm paying something for that hay, but I'm kind of getting a little coupon back, right, for those nutrients in that hay. If I do a good job at feeding that hay in the system, I can capitalize on the value of the nutrients in that hay. So this was just, I pulled this off of Facebook when I put this presentation together. Lots of hay. We had a very wet spring available, so I can buy hay for anywhere between $25 and $60 a bale. Always good quality, right? Nobody ever puts on Facebook Marketplace, I've got some really crappy hay that I want to sell you. It's always good quality hay, you know. But you can buy some decent quality hay if you're careful. And maybe you pay a little closer to $50 than you would $25. But and so if you look at the price of it, it's going to come in somewhere around $100 to $120 a ton for decent quality hay. But remember, you're getting that coupon back if you're doing a good job feeding it for $59 worth of nutrients for every ton of hay we bring back. The reason I'm showing you this is that for small or moderate-sized cattle producers, buying hay may be a much better option than making hay and buying fertilizer to stimulate that hay field. And when we buy that hay, we're bringing those nutrients into the grazing system. Now, how we feed that hay is important on capitalizing on the value of those nutrients. And we won't get all $59 back, but maybe we get 2/3 of it back if we're doing a good job with our hay feeding. So we always want to target our poorest pastures for feeding hay on. If I have a pasture that I know is low in soil fertility, because I did my soil test, that I want to start to build up that pasture, then that's a good candidate for feeding hay on in the winter months. I want to move my feeding points around that pasture, When I move that feeding points around that pasture, I get a better distribution of those nutrients. It doesn't matter how you move those feeding points around. I could put bales out and just move my feeding spot for those bales as I feed during the winter months. I could put all my bales out at once and do what we call bale grazing by laying all the bales out and then just putting a hot wire up and giving them access to a few bales at a time and moving through that system. I can unroll my hay. I can feed it in hay, the bale wagons. It doesn't matter, but somehow you've got to get those feeding points distributed out within that pasture. Too common, this is what we see when we feed hay. We're going to feed hay where it's easy to get to that hay out. So I got a hard surface road here, rock or paved or whatever, and it gets muddy in the wintertime, when it's cold, it's dark, I'm working off the farm, so it's easy just to stick a hay bale out here in this paddock. And that's commonly what producers do. And when we do that, we're not capitalizing on the value of those nutrients in that hay. We're concentrating all those nutrients in that one paddock. And that's exactly what Matt was showing in that diagram that Alan Franzlubers did, looking at the hot spots where they fed hay at. We're much better off if we can distribute that hay evenly throughout those paddocks. And when we do that, we're getting a much more even distribution of those nutrients, and we're capitalizing on the value of those nutrients in the hay. Okay, tip 6, incorporate legumes into grazing systems. Legumes are an important part of sustainable grassland ecosystems, right? So one of the major nutrients that limits production in grassland ecosystems is nitrogen. Legumes capture nitrogen from the air. Who knows what the concentration of nitrogen gas is in the air that we're breathing right now? Yeah. So yeah, about 78%, right? So we're breathing this in. We think of it as oxygen, but really it's 78% nitrogen gas, N2. But that nitrogen gas is not plant available. So legumes form a symbiotic relationship with rhizobium bacteria. On the roots of the plant, they form nodules. Inside the nodules, the rhizobium bacteria live. In exchange for that place to live on the root system and for an energy source in the form of sugars from that plant, those bacteria fix nitrogen from the air into a plant available form and share it with that legume plant. So we always talk about legumes sharing that nitrogen with the grass, and they do share it with the grass, but most of that sharing is indirect. So it's through the animal, and that's why grazing is an important part of that nitrogen sharing in grassland ecosystems. And then also dilutes the endophyte in tall fescue, so we see improved animal performance when we're managing tall fescue grazing systems. I think Matt will probably talk a little bit more about that as we go on in the day. And our research unit at the University of Kentucky found that there's a set of compounds called isoflavones in red clover that are actually vasodilators. So the ergot alkaloids cause the vascular system of the animal to shrink or get smaller when animals are grazing tall fescue, and the isoflavones in red clover actually are dilators, which allows that system to open back up. All right, tip 7, frost seed clover. So probably one of the easiest things for people to do if they're just getting started with regenerative grazing or improved grazing management is just to start to broadcast a little bit of red clover and white clover seed out onto pastures. Usually in the southeastern United States, it would be early to mid-February. And let the freezing and the thawing of the soil cause cracks to form and incorporate that seed. An important part of this is close grazing prior to throwing the seed out and then controlling that sod after that clover seed starts to germinate. Works best with red and white clover. This is what we recommend in Kentucky, 6 to 8 pounds of red clover and 1 to 2 pounds of ladino clover. And we broadcast that in late winter, mid to late winter, usually around February 15th or so. We've got a nice publication on frost seeding. It's included on your drive, I think. And one of the things that we've started to do with our publications is make a box that's called at a glance. And you know how producers operate. They wait till the last minute to do something, right? Except for Matt. Matt's always on top of it. But the last thing they want to do is sit down and read a 5-page publication at the last minute. So we put a box in that's just a bulleted list of the most important concepts to take away from that publication. Okay, tip 8, we managing nitrogen applications, and ideally, over time, we'd want to wean ourselves off of commercial nitrogen, and a lot of regenerative grazers have accomplished this. But in the meantime, sometimes we need to do that more slowly because we don't want the whole system to crash. So, number one thing to think about if you're going to use nitrogen fertilizer, it only makes sense if you're going to utilize that forage. So if I already have too much forage growth in the spring and I put more nitrogen on in the spring to stimulate even more growth that I'm not going to be able to utilize, is that a good investment? Probably not. So most of the time in grazing systems in Kentucky, we would recommend nitrogen applications in late summer or fall to stimulate fall tall fescue growth for stockpiling. So consider using the lower end of recommended ranges, and over time, as your nitrogen cycle improves in your pastures, we start getting legumes, we're having better distribution of dung and urine, and we have more microbial activity in the soil taking place and more nitrogen being mineralized from organic matter. We'll see a lower need for nitrogen within that system. And that's kind of what the last point is there. So ideally, eventually, we would limit the amount of total nitrogen that we're distributing within a regenerative grazing system. Matt, do you apply nitrogen on your farm?
Very sparingly. Occasionally, ryegrass, some real early grazing, and that's a little bit on fescue in the fall where we have good fescue.
Yeah. So I had a grazer in Virginia when I was there, and he has quit applying nitrogen for stockpiling, and because it's a little bit of a risk, right? We get a dry fall like we have now, and we just don't get the response to that nitrogen, and we can lose nitrogen, especially urea, through volatilization in late fall if we don't get a little bit of rain to get it incorporated into the soil. But his philosophy was I'm going to quit applying nitrogen. I'm just going to buy a little bit more hay. He says, I know I've got the hay then in the system. You know, I don't always know that I'm going to get that response to the nitrogen. The other thing is that as grazing management improves and the nitrogen improves on your farm, sometimes we don't get the response to that nitrogen that we think that we should get. A lot of our fertility work with stockpiling has been done under, I don't want to call them artificial conditions, but they've been done under more of a hay-type situation. And we see a very good response to that fertilizer under that hay type of situation. In a grazing system, we may not see quite that same response to that additional nitrogen fertilizer for stockpiling. 5 minutes? Okay. I'm about done here. So usually in the humid eastern United States, we'd recommend every 2 to 3 years that you take a soil test, just so you can kind of track things over time. And in a rangeland situation, I'm not a range guy. Matt, do you have any comments? But it's going to be harder to manage soil fertility in a rangeland situation, so I'm not sure. Yeah, you don't really measure it, right? Now, if you're in a cover crop situation, say you're under a center pivot in a more arid area, then soil testing would make more sense to do on a regular basis so that you can kind of keep up with fertility.
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. Like his comments about, for instance, being sparing on nitrogen, I would argue in annual forage systems, you are very
for
what they're trying to accomplish.
for mineral supplementation to
Yeah, exactly. What crops are going to do well?
yeah.
Oh, what plants are going to do well?
Yeah.
So, kind of a, sorry, it was a, yeah, I got a question.
Well, the important part of your question is that there's a lot of gray in grazing systems, right? So, yeah. All right, I'm just going to finish up with this slide because I'm about out. But the point that I want to make with this slide is that nutrient removal, if we're making hay within the grazing system, or hay on dedicated fields, then we really have to watch the nutrient removal from those hay stands. Hay is a big nutrient consumer, so every ton of hay is removing 40 to 60 pounds of nitrogen, 15 pounds of P2O5, and 40, 60 pounds of potash. So watching those, I can almost always tell when someone brings a soil sample in whether it was a hayfield or not, because they're almost always low in potash, right? Because we usually never put enough potash back. So tracking your hayfields closely is really important to maintaining good hay production over time. All right, I'll just end with this slide. We have a really good website at the University of Kentucky, and I'm trying to make sure, I think that QR code takes us to our UK Forages website. It has about 10 or 12 icons on it for different categories, and we've got all of our publications arranged underneath those icons. We also have an upcoming events calendar, and then a link to our YouTube webpage. We are recording the presentations from today, and we'll be posting those on our YouTube web page. If you want to come back and watch them, we'll recommend them to another veterinarian or producer to watch. And we've got about 500 videos on there of different meetings and conferences and so forth. And amazingly, we get about 180,000 views a year. And my wife always says, who in the world watches those things, right? People with some real mental illness, I guess. All right, is there any questions?
When I was in Oregon and on the West Coast there, we used to hammer ryegrass fields, tillable area with nitrogen in the spring, and to have grazing, but also hay test. When you talk about plant composition and nitrogen, I mean, I had some pastures that were analyzed at 35% crude protein. That's crazy for feeding a beef cattle.
Right.
And even for a dairy cattle.
Right.
And the soluble protein was extremely high. What marker or metric could you use to sort of gauge it? If you're only, again, I've had a few programs that I've done with my agronomists, and the agronomists, of course, growing grass loves potassium, but from an animal nutrition perspective, potassium is about the last thing we want in our forages because of the interaction it has with magnesium and calcium homeostasis. So we always go back and forth about what levels should you be doing. And it is there. I mean, we have some good numbers on potassium levels that we want to see in our forages. But the nitrogen side, because obviously that pasture that's 35% crude protein is mostly non-protein nitrogen sources, I would imagine.
Right.
Amino acids or something, and not true protein in the grass.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Matt, do you have any comments on that? There's an energetic cost for getting rid of extra nitrogen within the
There's potential
system.
cost with reproduction, and if you don't have the carbohydrates that capture that nitrogen, that readily available nitrogen in the rumen, you're going to run BUN levels, skyrocket BUN levels.
Right. So I guess the main point is not to over fertilize with nitrogen.
Right, so I guess we're only
But most of our soil tests are not really evaluating nitrogen anyways. Yeah. Yeah, so our nitrogen recommendations are generally made on previous yield trials, and I don't know. My thought is, in Mary, I'll talk about annual pastures, but I had a graduate student who worked with annual pastures, and sometimes their economics are kind of questionable. So we've got to think a lot about inputs in grazing systems, and if we can lower inputs, we can improve our nitrogen cycle and reduce the amount of fertilizer in the system. That's probably going to be and still maintain a decent level of productivity within the system. That's going to be a pretty important goal of a regenerative grazing system. So maybe applying nitrogen more frequently in smaller quantities may be a better management strategy than throwing it all on ahead of time like you would on a corn crop. Okay. Yeah.
I think one of the problems is that the cost of nitrogen has really dramatically increased. And so where a lot of our recommendations come from, like 30 years ago in America. Right.
Yeah.
That's right. But like on the perennial ryegrass, one thing we know is that will increase in yield. I mean, so it increases dry matter yield. And at one time, that was economical way to produce how much feed you had to the cows, even though we know it increased protein and maybe causes some problems with the high. We overdo it. Nevertheless, back where our recommendations came from, nitrogen was way
20 cents a pound. Yeah.
and so we get some yield. When you can get a break-even yield a lot quicker than you can with current nitrogen.
Yeah. I think the bottom line is we really need to think about, in perennial systems, if we can reduce the amount of nitrogen inputs into the system. I mean, that's really kind of the direction we should be moving in most cases. And like Mary said, there's going to be areas or forages, types that will respond to some nitrogen fertilizer.
Maybe ties in. You have comments on foliar applications of nutrients, particularly this client has been using this as a seasonal calving dairy herd that has been utilizing some foliar treatments to boost production when they really need heavier amounts of, when their cows are producing more milk. And I think that maybe allows them to titrate the nitrogen a little bit and the nutrients to get some more growth without.
Okay. So maybe the best use of a foliar application of fertilizer would be for micronutrients in most cases. Nitrogen, whenever I add water to a primary nutrient, whether it's nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium, I'm increasing the cost of that nutrient because I've got to move that water around. I don't know. I think dry granular fertilizer, there's a lot of advertisements for liquid fertilizer, but dry granular generally is the best buy for nutrients. I don't know. What do you think, Matt?
I don't know. I was going to throw you another question. I mean, because it's around like compost heat, you start to see, what do you make of those kinds of things? I mean, are those ways of subtly really helping things, or is it just focus?
Well, there may be something to it, but I think our primary focus should be on improving grazing management, and that will probably do more for improving productivity than adding a compost tea to your pasture or some humic acid or other additives. Yeah, yeah, it's 5 pounds of sea salt per acre. So there's lots of things out there, but nothing is going to pay you back like improved grazing management, you know. So I don't know with the micro, I mean, maybe with the micro minerals we're getting a response to a foliar application, but in most forage systems, if we adjust soil pH and it's in a reasonable range of 6 to 7, most of our micronutrients are going to be readily available to the plant.